Welcome to our latest series on balancing the budget. And as Australia attempts to tackle long-term structural deficits, how much can we afford to spend on neighbours in need? Now, the Gillard government had committed Australia to a long-term foreign aid expenditure of 0.5% of gross national income by 2016. But this figure was repeatedly pushed back as the nation fell into deficit. 0.5% of GNI is far below the UN target of 0.7%, but even reaching this reduced figure required something in the order of a budget increase of $1 billion year on year, every year until 2017. Now, Labor allocated $5.7 billion to foreign aid in the 2013 budget, a figure that was then slashed by $650 million by the coalition in January. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop indicated the government would seek further savings of $4.5 billion over 4 years by restricting raises in the aid budget strictly to CPI. So is Australia attempting to balance its books by abandoning its international obligations? I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Herskovich, a research fellow for the Centre for Independent Studies based in Beijing. So Benjamin, are we abandoning our friends in need?
Often in the debate about Australia's aid budget, the focus is on the headline figure. How many billions of dollars are we pushing overseas to developing nations in need? But I think the key question is not so much the quantity of the aid spend, it's the quality of the results associated with that aid spend. So you can have a massive aid budget, but you can produce relatively poor results for developing nations in need. And what the government is trying to do here is actually scale back the aid budget, put a cap on it, keep it at $5 billion for the next few years and reorganize it and put some performance benchmarks in place so that we actually get much more efficient and effective aid spending. So I think the simple answer is no, not necessarily. It really depends on how the government goes forward with the process of putting performance benchmarks in place.
There's a second audience for aid, or the aid budget, right? And that is actually that top line number. If you look at Australia's position in terms of our percentage of GNI which goes to aid, it's quite small compared to the Scandinavian countries, even the UK, who has 0.7%. In terms of Australia's place at the international table and building relationships with other countries, surely cutting back on our aid budget, though, is damaging in terms of our foreign perception.
There are probably 2 points to make on that. One is that it's crucial for Australia to have, I suppose, the courage of conviction and say, well, in actual fact, there may be problems with the orthodox way of delivering aid. Maybe we need to be focusing not so much on the headline figure, but also the quality of the aid and whether the aid is actually going towards instituting the necessary domestic reforms in aid recipient countries. And then I suppose the second point is that even though there is a concern about Australia pulling back from its commitments, it seems as if the government is once again going to be picking up at least the commitment to get to 0.5% of gross national income. And the suggestion is that by the latter years of this decade, they'll be getting close to that, something like 0.47% of gross national income. And the aid budget by that time will have ballooned to something like $10 billion once again. And I think there's actually a really interesting parallel in the debate about the aid budget with the debate about the defense budget. So often in that debate about the defense budget, we focus on the headline figure. How many billions of dollars are we spending on defense? And governments will say, well, we need to get back to a defense budget that's roughly equivalent to 2% of GDP. But it's really a debate that involves having a conversation about concrete capabilities and real world needs, but in a completely abstract realm. We're saying how many billions of dollars will we spend on aid? How many billions of dollars will we spend on defense? When the key question shouldn't be the number. The key question should be, what do we actually want to do with our defense budget? What specific capabilities do we need? And similarly, with the aid budget, what are we actually trying to achieve here and how are we going to get to that goal? It's not just about shoveling money out the door and getting a glowing feeling and getting praise from Scandinavian friends who spend 0.7% of gross national income on aid.
Now, you're based in Beijing, so obviously you're very tapped into Australia's perception in China. But I guess one of the things that people are focused on is how can Australia play a much bigger part in the Asian century? You know, this is going to be where the growth is going to come from over the next 50 to 100 years. Therefore, shouldn't we be spending more on aid in there, given that there will be some dividend, one would hope, 10, 20 years later?
I think the key economic story of the Asian century is not going to be about aid contributing to development. It will be about free trade contributing to massive economic growth. I mean, the story of our good friends and extremely successful friends in Asia, South Korea, China, increasingly Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on, is one of freer trade, more open markets, fueling manufacturing growth, fueling trade in services and goods and resources. And I think that's probably what our friends in Asia would expect of us. It's not so much shoveling out $8 to developing nations in need in the South Pacific. It's about showing some leadership on trade and liberalizing our trade even further and pushing forward with multilateral trade agreements as well as specific bilateral agreements. On that, I suppose there's a really interesting point to be made about the approach taken by China, where they're spending massive amounts of money on aid, but it's very much in a pragmatic realpolitik kind of fashion. The goal there is not actually to achieve benefits for the recipient countries. It's really to find additional markets for Chinese goods and services and to find employment for Chinese workers. So they wouldn't necessarily be looking for moral leadership from Australia, and they wouldn't be expecting moral leadership from Australia. They'd be wanting hard-edged trade.
More about helping people help themselves. Benjamin Herskovich, thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Good to be with you.